I usually draw digital, but since I want to apply to a design-focused art school, I need a hand-drawn portfolio. So today I decided to draw my first pencil portrait. My setup is extremely simple, just one sketchbook and a pencil. But the sketchbook has slightly thicker paper. I start with a simple oval shape for the head. Then I added the neck and began placing guidelines. First, I drew the typical vertical center line to define the direction the face is looking at. After that, I set the proportions by drawing horizontal lines for the eyes, nose, mouth and the start of the hairline. Then I added the ear. Once that was done, I roughly blocked in the outline of the hair and sketched the bridge of the nose. After that, I moved on to the eyebrows, defined the contours of the eyes and added the iris. I then refined the ear shape and went back to the hair. Here I only focused on the overall silhouette, keeping everything very rough. After that I added a few loose hair strands, moved on to the mouth, kept it very rough and then sketched the throat. As you may have noticed, I drew everything very lightly in the first stage. And that helped a lot, because I could clearly see mistakes in the face proportions and adjust them early. This step is especially important since there is no liquify tool or moving layers like in digital art. Once I was happy with the structure, I cleaned up the lines. Then I sketched a t-shirt and shifted my focus back to the hair. I made sure that the haircut looked believable by following the direction of the hair flow from the reference. After that, I refined the nose and finally the mouth. I also added a few subtle folds around the cheeks. At this point, the sketch felt very dark. So I carefully went over the entire drawing with an eraser to lighten it up and prepare it for shading. And if you're enjoying this video so far, I would highly appreciate if you would like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would really help me a lot. For shading, I used a technique called hatching. I start very roughly on the forehead and gradually work my way down to the neck. Whenever I wanted to make an area darker, like the lips or the eye sockets, I used cross hatching. Next, I added the pupils as simple dots. I always do this early because it instantly gives the face life and makes the portrait feel more complete. Overall, I tried to focus on getting the values right, which was definitely challenging. There is no undo and even the eraser often removes more than you want. Compared to drawing on the iPad, this felt way more challenging. In the next step, I focused only on adding darker values. I start with the hair and made sure to really press the pencil harder. At the same time, I knew that mistakes at this stage would be extremely dangerous, because dark pencil lines are almost impossible to erase completely. Because of that, I intentionally left some areas completely white. After that, I darkened the eyebrows and the eyes, shaded the mouth, added more values to the forehead and deepened the shadow on the throat. And at that point, the portrait was basically finished. For a first pencil portrait study, I think it turned out pretty great. Coming from digital art, this was honestly way harder than expected. With pencil, you can't have bad proportions behind effects or brushes. If the drawing is wrong, it's basically wrong. But that's also the biggest advantage of drawing traditional. It exposes your weakness immediately and forces you to fix them at the root. Now I need to give you some context. My mom told me that watercolors are extremely simple. I searched for a relatively simple beach reference and decided to paint it without watching any tutorials. I start with the sand and the struggle began immediately, especially with the color palette. I made a lot of mistakes. For example, I tried to achieve brighter colors by mixing in opaque white, which in watercolor is obviously not the right approach. Somehow it worked, more or less. Then I tried to capture the wet sand. Long story short, this painting didn't go as planned at all, and I eventually let it go. Because of that, I was pretty demotivated when it comes to paint with watercolors. So I went back to what felt more familiar, pencil drawing. But this time I choose a different subject, an animal, a bird. I start with the small head and my main goal was to establish the overall outline first. I set the length of the wing and sketched in what I'd call the belly. After that, I made sure that the head proportions felt right by sketching in the eye and a simple cheek shape. These acted as guidelines for me. Then I moved on to the wings. I kept them very rough at first, and honestly I hated how round the wingtips looked, instead of sharp. I also added the belly line and drew the tail. After that I sketched in the claws. After placing the main shape, I went back and sharpened the wings, adding more definition and texture to make them feel more dynamic. Then I started shading the head. At this stage I only placed one single grey tone to avoid creating visual chaos. Once the face was done, I applied some approach to the chest. Or belly, you know what I mean. After establishing that first value pass, I returned to the face and began placing darker tones. I then sharpened my pencil to achieve very values and thin, precise lines. I mainly used the sharp pencil for the wings, but also added subtle contour lines to separate different areas. Finally, I let the paper texture show through in some places and added a few light hatching strokes. And the study was done. This bird study taught me the importance of working in clean stages instead of jumping straight into the details. Starting rough helped me to control the proportions, and focusing on sharper edges made a huge difference. Limiting myself to one grey tone at first kept the drawing clean and prevented chaos. Building darker values later made the forms much cleaner. Overall, it reminded me that strong structure and value control matter way more than detail. And finally, I gave watercolors a second try, but this time for a reason. I was in the city with my dad and saw some watercolors, so I bought them. I know I already own some, and technically you can mix any color anyway, and the quality probably doesn't matter that much, but buying them gave me a huge motivational boost. This time I actually started watching some tutorials and tried to understand how watercolors really work. I followed a YouTube tutorial, and honestly it might be the worst choice possible. I painted along with the tutorial, almost like a Bob Ross video. And long story short, it felt like a tech tutorial, where the instructor tells you what to do, only to mention important things after it's already too late. I start with a sketch using 1-point perspective, drawing rough skyscrapers and cars. Then I moved on to the street. Again, finding the right colors was challenging, but somehow it worked. Yeah, I was pretty mad at that point. I also realized I used way too much water and paint, especially on the street. Just look how much I wasted there. Luckily, I still had plenty of darker colors in my palette in case things went wrong. After letting everything dry, I moved on to the brighter colors. This is where I actually learned something very important about watercolors. If you want brighter colors in your paintings, you have to place them first. Only after that can you go over them with darker tones. I applied bright colors in the skyscrapers first, and slowly started to feel more comfortable with watercolors. At least that's what I thought. After letting it dry again, I moved on to darker tones and started painting over the bright areas to define the buildings. In my opinion, it quickly turned into a complete mess. And again, the tutorial wasn't helping, especially the next step. I added red stripes for car reflections and then had to wet almost the entire paper. After that, I supposed to drop a dark color and tilt the paper so the paint would flow and create reflections. And honestly, I completely failed. I showed the painting to my dad and explained the process. The moment he heard about the tilting technique, he just said, "Yeah, wrong tutorial." So I quit that painting. But I did one less study, and here is my reaction. So here we have a study that I just did right now, and as you can see, it looks absolutely terrible. I absolutely hate the result. It's so much chaos. I even tried to do this picture with, with a structure, but I'll be honest, I don't want to say hate watercolors because I see the potential of them, but I don't know, like for example here, I thought it would look like this. Like I thought because I did the exact same steps, but it ended up like this, like way more saturated and way darker. And when that happened, the whole chaos happened, because at the beginning everything was colored like this, everything was stable. I would call it stable. But yeah, and everything was blue, and then I tried to add some purple, but you can see what happened. It's just, yeah, and no undo is just criminal. So what's the conclusion? You might think I'd go back to digital art after all that frustration, but if I'm being honest, these last days of studying watercolors, failing and watching tutorials actually motivated me more than anything to do art again. When I went back to the iPad to continue some digital paintings, it felt like Minecraft creative mode basically. Undo, move tools, liquefy, everything suddenly felt effortless. If you want to see more of my traditional process, make sure to like this video. And if you have any tips or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm actually enjoying art again, and I hope this video motivates some of you too. That's it for today, and peace out.